to fulfill the wishes of our victims and to achieve justice and a just result for both the victims and the defendants. Those aren't always the same thing. This is an extremely tragic case, and I can't comment on what the evidence is at this point in time. All I can comment on.
Where's Adam's face?
Let's go away.
Where's our rights? Where's our rights? Thank you.
Get into the vehicle.
Back away from the guys.
Roman and Ruslan Gluccoy were once the pride of their community in Antelope, California. They were elite wrestlers, high-level athletes with the kind of talent that could have taken them all the way to the top. They had that twin synergy on the mat, moving with a rhythm that left opponents in the dirt. But somewhere along the line, the gold medal dream turned into a get-rich-quick scheme. They got caught up in the wrong vibe, pills, fast money, and a reckless ego that made them feel untouchable. Instead of training for the podium, they were out here hitting licks and acting like they were above the law. It's a heavy feeling knowing how much potential they flushed down the drain. They went from being local heroes to being two cats who were looking for a crash out without even realizing it. Their bond, which should have been their strength, became a shared descent into darkness. By April 2014, they weren't just brothers, they were a two-man wrecking crew ready to ignite a tragedy that would haunt the state of California forever.
Roman and Ruslan Gluccoy officially hit the point of no return when they were caught in the middle of a burglary. When the feds rolled up, the twins didn't surrender. They chose to full send it. They jumped into a stolen BMW and initiated a high-speed chase that was straight up suicidal. They were tearing through the streets of Auburn at speeds over 100 miles per hour, treating the public roads like their own personal racetrack. The adrenaline was clearly blinding them to the reality that they were driving a 2-ton weapon. They were so locked in on escaping that they didn't care about the lives they were putting at risk. It was a terrifying scene. Sirens wailing, helicopters overhead, and two brothers pushing a car to its absolute breaking point. The ride-or-die pact they'd made was now playing out in real time, and the energy was pure chaos. They were driving like men who had nothing to lose, but they were about to take everything from people who were just trying to get home. The speed was a blur, and the danger was at a code red level. Roman and Ruslan Gluccoy's chase ended in the most heart-wrenching way possible. As they blew through a red light at a busy intersection, they slammed into a small white car with a force that was absolutely catastrophic. Inside that car was a family, a father and his young daughter, who never stood a chance. The impact was so violent it shredded both vehicles, leaving a scene of mangled metal and shattered lives. The unlucky victims were gone in an instant because two brothers couldn't handle the consequences of their own actions. The twins actually tried to book it on foot after the crash, showing a level of cowardice that was just as disgusting as their recklessness. Seeing the debris and realizing that innocent people were dead because of a petty burglary is enough to make your heart sink. It wasn't just a crash, it was a total destruction of a family's future. The twins had traded their athletic legacy for a permanent L that would be written in the blood of innocence.
Seeing them in there today, was that hard to do? I mean, we saw you visibly emotional in there.
This is one of the hardest things that I think anyone involved has ever had to deal with.
Roman and Ruslan Gluccoy finally faced the music in a courtroom that was filled with the heavy grief of the victims' families. The wrestling stars were now just two convicts sitting in orange jumpsuits looking at a mountain of evidence that they couldn't wrestle their way out of. The legal hammer dropped hard. Roman was convicted of first-degree murder, and Ruslan was hit with second-degree murder charges. They were handed life sentences, a folded end to a story that could have been so different. The community was left asking how two talented kids could become such monsters. In prison, the twins are separated from the world they terrorized, living with the permanent weight of the lives they snuffed out for a stolen car. It's a somber reminder that being day ones doesn't give you a pass to destroy others. They'll grow old behind bars, their names synonymous with a senseless tragedy rather than any sports achievement. Their bond is now a chain that binds them to a lifetime of regret and concrete walls.
It seemed everyone in Fremont County, Colorado, knew of Joel and Michael Stovall.
They were completely identical. Everybody just called them the Stovall Twins.
But no one could have ever known just how twisted their unusual bond would become.
Most boys at that age are more interested in cars and girls. They were more interested in guns.
Joel and Michael Stovall were the kind of twins who shared everything, from their identical looks to their absolute reckless disregard for the law. In the small-town, quiet vibes of Eagle County, Colorado, back in 2001, these two were already known for being total wildcards and local troublemakers. They weren't just brothers, they were a two-man army, a duo that lived by their own rules and didn't give a single rip about the system. On that fateful night, they were rolling in their truck, probably thinking they were untouchable, but they were carrying enough heavy heat in the back to start a small-scale war. When Deputy Jim Carter spotted their vehicle and flipped on those cherry tops for what should have been a routine traffic stop, he had no clue he was stepping straight into a waking nightmare. The Stovall twins weren't about to play nice, take a ticket, or respect the badge. They were strapped and ready to crash out rather than face the music. As the deputy approached their window, the air got heavy with that do-or-die energy. It wasn't just a stop anymore, it was the spark of a massive tragedy. The twins looked at each other, that silent communication passing between them that only siblings have, and they made a choice that would stain the mountain snow with blood. They weren't just looking for trouble, they were looking to burn the whole thing down. Joel and Michael Stovall didn't bother with a conversation. They let the lead do all the talking. As Deputy Carter got close to the truck, the twins unleashed a hail of gunfire that turned a quiet mountain road into a total war zone. It was straight up savage. They were firing high-powered rifles, including an AK-47, with zero regard for human life or the consequences. The deputy didn't stand a chance in that initial ambush. He was hit multiple times, falling to the cold ground, while these two brothers kept the hammer down, fueled by adrenaline that was pumping through their veins like ice water. They weren't just shooting to escape, they were shooting to kill. It was a heart-wrenching scene. A lawman just doing his job, now fighting for his life in the dirt, while the Stovall twins peeled rubber and vanished into the darkness like ghosts. The sheer cold-blooded nature of the attack sent shockwaves through the entire department. This wasn't a petty crime gone wrong. This was a calculated execution attempt by two cats who had completely lost their minds. They left behind a trail of shell casings and a shattered community, fueled by a bond that had turned toxic and deadly. They were officially on the run, labeled as armed and extremely dangerous, and the most intense hunt in Colorado history was on. The emotional weight of the tragedy began to sink in as the sirens started wailing. Joel and Michael Stovall led the police on a 60-mile high-speed manhunt that looked like a scene from a high-budget action flick. But the stakes were painfully, terrifyingly real. They tore through the rugged Colorado mountains, pushing their vehicle to the absolute limit while engaging in multiple shootouts with every officer who dared to block their path. It was a full-send situation, reckless, desperate, and fueled by a ride-or-die pact. The twins were posted up in their truck, taking turns firing out the windows with military-grade weapons, turning the scenic highway into a literal shooting gallery. Other officers were getting hit, police cruisers were being shredded by bullets, and the chaos was spreading like wildfire across the county. This wasn't just a chase, it was a rolling battle between a two-man militia and the law. The bond between Joel and Michael was their greatest weapon and their biggest curse. They were so locked in with each other that they didn't care about the carnage they were leaving in their wake. People in the nearby mountain towns were locking their doors and huddling in fear, terrified of the twins who were terrorizing the landscape. The emotional toll on the pursuing officers was massive. They were watching their brothers in arms get wounded while trying to stop two men who clearly had no intention of being taken alive. Joel and Michael Stovall finally reached the end of the line when they were cornered in a heavily wooded area near Glenwood Canyon. The ride-or-die dream was crashing down hard and fast around them. After hours of terrorizing the state, the weight of their actions finally started to press in, and the walls were closing in. They were surrounded by a small army of tactical teams, and for the first time that night, the twins realized they were absolutely cooked. They eventually surrendered, coming out with their hands up, but the damage was already done and irreversible. Deputy Jim Carter, the man they first shot, miraculously survived his wounds, but the physical and mental scars would haunt him for a lifetime. When the legal hammer finally dropped, the Stovall twins were completely folded by the system. They were convicted on multiple counts, including attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The emotional fallout was devastating for their own family, too, who had to watch two brothers they once loved become the faces of pure, unadulterated evil. In separate cells, the twins finally had to face the reality that their special bond had only led them to a lifetime of concrete and cold steel. They went from being inseparable siblings to being cautionary tales of how a shared life can turn into a shared tragedy.
Lie while under interrogation and even mock officers after their arrest. Tonight, you'll see those same twin sisters admit to brutally killing their mother.
Jismaya and Tasmia Whitehead were the ultimate day ones, a pair of identical twins from Conyers, Georgia, who looked like the definition of success on the outside. They were honors students, bright, and had that twin synergy that made everyone think they were destined for greatness. But behind the closed doors of their suburban crib, the energy was straight up toxic. Their mother, Nikki Whitehead, was a single mom trying her best to keep her girls on the right path, but the tension was at a boiling point. The girls wanted that no-rules lifestyle, wanting to hang out with a rougher crowd and stay out late, while Nikki was trying to be the enforcer to save their futures. This wasn't just typical teenage rebellion. This was a deep-seated, simmering rage that was ready to explode. The twins were so locked into each other that they created an us versus her mentality, viewing their own mother as the enemy rather than their protector. People in the community saw the smiles and the good grades, but they didn't see the crash-out energy that was brewing in the hallways of that house. By January 2010, the honor student mask was starting to crack, and the twins were looking at their mother like she was a barrier they needed to remove. They were two brilliant minds fueled by a dark shared impulse that was about to turn a quiet Georgia morning into a scene of absolute, unadulterated horror that would shock the nation. Jismaya and Tasmia Whitehead finally reached their breaking point on the morning of January 13, 2010. What started as a regular argument about being late for school quickly spiraled into a barbaric, all-out brawl in the bathroom. It wasn't a fair fight. It was two healthy, athletic teenagers against their mother in a confined space. The twins went beast mode in the worst way possible, using a vase and then a kitchen knife to attack Nikki with a level of savagery that made no sense. They weren't just trying to escape, they were trying to finish her. Nikki fought for her life, even managed to bite and scratch them, but the twins were a relentless tag team. After the deed was done and the floor was stained red, they didn't call for help or show a single shred of remorse. Instead, they took a shower, cleaned themselves up, and headed to school like nothing happened. Later that afternoon, they played the victim role to perfection, finding their mother's body and running to the neighbors screaming for help. They put on a show that would have won an Oscar, sobbing and acting like their world had just been shattered. They thought they were slick enough to fool the feds in the local PD, thinking their sweet girl image would be a permanent shield. But the darkness they'd unleashed in that bathroom left behind receipts that no amount of fake tears could ever wash away. Jismaya and Tasmia Whitehead found themselves in the hot seat almost immediately as the detectives started sniffing around their story. From the jump, things were looking real sketchy. The girls had scratches all over their arms and hands, which they claimed were from a fight with each other, but the police weren't buying that sibling rivalry excuse for a second. The twins were acting like they were big mad at the intruders who took their mom, but their timelines were all over the place. Why were they late for school? Why were their clothes in the wash? The pressure started to mount as the forensic team began digging through the house, finding DNA and blood evidence that pointed straight back to the honor students. Even though they were twins and had that ride-or-die pact, the detectives knew that if they squeezed hard enough, the truth would eventually leak out. For months, the girls tried to maintain the lie, even moving in with relatives and trying to live a normal life while the investigation simmered. But you can't outrun that kind of bad energy forever. The Fed talk was getting more intense, and the evidence was piling up like a mountain. By the time the warrants were finally issued, the twins realized they were absolutely cooked. The community that had once cheered for them was now looking at them with pure disgust as the reality of the matricide started to sink in. Jasmia and Tasmia Whitehead saw their double danger act finally hit a brick wall in the courtroom. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the possibility of the needle, the twins finally decided to take a plea deal. In a heart-wrenching confession session, they detailed exactly how they jumped their mother and watched the life leave her eyes. It was a total crash-out moment where they finally admitted that their bond had turned into a murder pact. Both sisters were sentenced to 30 years in the pen, a long stretch that would take away the prime of their lives. They went from being the pride of Conyers to being cautionary tales about how toxic synergy can destroy a family from the inside out. In prison, the identical twins were finally separated, forced to face the quiet of their own choices without the other one there to validate their rage. The tragedy wasn't just for Nikki Whitehead, who lost her life at the hands of her own flesh and blood, but for the girls themselves, who threw away every bit of their potential for a moment of uncontrolled malice. They are a somber reminder that being day ones doesn't mean you should follow each other into the abyss. They'll be middle-aged women by the time they see the sun as free citizens again, living with the permanent brand of being the Whitehead Sisters, the honor students who chose a life of concrete and steel over a mother's love.
Of Heather DeWild, her husband Daniel DeWild, reaching a plea deal this afternoon, pleading guilty to second-degree murder. 7 News reporter Lance Hernandez live at the Jefferson County Justice Center, and Lance, DeWild admitted hitting his wife on the head.
And when a judge inside that Justice Center asked Daniel DeWild if he hit his wife on the head and put a rope around her neck, he said yes. That answer stunned Heather DeWild's family.
Daniel and David DeWild were the kind of brothers who took that twin bond to a dark, twisted level that nobody saw coming. Back in 2003 in Edgewater, Colorado, Daniel was going through a messy, toxic divorce with his wife, Heather DeWild. It wasn't just a breakup, it was a full-on war over the kids and the future. Daniel was feeling the heat, and instead of taking the high road, he tapped in his brother David to help him handle the problem. These two were day ones in the literal sense, and they were rolling deep in a plan that was straight-up evil. Heather was just a dedicated mom of two trying to move on with her life, but she didn't realize she was being scouted by the two people she should have been able to trust. On a bright July morning, Daniel lured her over to his crib with the promise of some child support money and to pick up some of the kids' stuff. It was a total setup, a trap house vibe without the drugs. He knew Heather would show up because she always put her kids first. As she walked through that door, the twins were already in sync, plotting a move that would end in a total tragedy. They weren't just brothers anymore. They were a two-man execution squad. Daniel and David DeWild didn't waste any time once Heather was inside the house. While the kids were safely out of sight, things got barbaric in the basement. They jumped her, and it wasn't a fair fight. It was two grown men against one woman. They ended up using a noose or some kind of ligature to end her life, a cold and calculated move that showed they had zero soul left. The sheer savagery of twins working together to murder the mother of Daniel's children is enough to make anyone's stomach turn. They were so locked in that they probably didn't even have to speak. They just moved like a single lethal unit. After the deed was done, they didn't panic. They went into full scrub mode, trying to wipe the scene and hide the evidence like they were stars in a forensic crime show. They wrapped her body in trash bags and duct tape, treating her like she was just some garbage they needed to dispose of. David was the ultimate wingman in the worst way possible, helping his brother move the body and dump it in a shallow grave near a canyon. They thought they were being low-key, thinking they'd pulled off the perfect hit and could just go back to their regular lives. Daniel and David DeWild thought they were smarter than the feds, but the heat was rising fast. For weeks, Heather was just a missing person on a poster, and the twins played it cool, acting like they had no idea where she went. They tried to keep their stories straight, thinking their twin connection would keep them from slipping up. But the police weren't buying the act. They knew Daniel was a person of interest from the jump because the divorce was so nasty. When hikers finally stumbled upon Heather's remains months later, the game was officially over. The forensics started to point directly back to the brothers. Investigators found that they'd been watching crime shows to learn how to beat the system, which is just straight up chilling. They tried to be slick with the cleanup, but you can't hide that kind of bad energy forever. The community was shook to the core. How could two brothers do this? The pressure started to mount, and the ride or die pact they'd made was about to hit a major brick wall. The feds were closing in, and the twins were starting to realize that their shared secret was a weight that was going to drown them both. Daniel and David DeWild finally saw their twin power crumble when the legal system threw the book at them. In a wild twist that proved there's no honor among thieves or killers, David eventually decided to save his own skin. The ultimate sibling betrayal happened in the courtroom. David flipped and started snitching on Daniel to get a lighter deal. He admitted to helping move the body and detailed the whole horrific plan they'd cooked up together. It was a crash out of the highest order. Daniel was left holding the bag, and he was eventually convicted of first-degree murder, getting handed a life sentence without any hope of getting out. David got a lighter stretch for his cooperation, but the damage to their bond was permanent. They went from being inseparable day ones to being enemies in the eyes of the law. The real tragedy, though, was for Heather's kids, who lost their mom and their dad in one fell swoop because of two brothers' ego and malice. The DeWild twins are a cold reminder that a sibling bond can be a beautiful thing, but when it turns toxic, it can be a straight-up death sentence for anyone caught in the crossfire. Kenyatta and Keyshawn Blake were the definition of day ones who took the wrong fork in the road and never looked back. Growing up in an environment where the hustle was the only way out, these twins didn't want to wait for a 9-to-5 paycheck. They wanted the fast life, and they wanted it right now. They were inseparable, a two-man crew that moved with a level of ride-or-die energy that made the neighborhood nervous. While other kids were focused on sports or school, the Blake twins were busy being posted up on the block, learning the rules of the street and looking for a come-up. They had that twin synergy where they didn't even need to speak to know what the other was thinking, a silent language that they eventually used to coordinate their moves. They were young, reckless, and always strapped, viewing the world through a lens of us versus everyone. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the rep, the respect, and the adrenaline of the life. They thought they were untouchable because they had each other's backs, but they were really just two young men on a high-speed collision course with the system. The tragedy started long before the first shot was fired. It began when they decided that their bond was better used for crime than for building a future. They were a ticking time bomb in their community, fueled by a shared ego that made them feel like kings of a concrete empire that was built on a foundation of sand. Kenyatta and Keyshawn Blake decided to officially crash out when they orchestrated a home invasion that turned into a total bloodbath. They weren't just looking to snatch some jewelry and bounce, they came in heavy, looking to exert dominance and leave a mark. On that dark night, they targeted a crib thinking it was going to be an easy hit-a-lick scenario, but the vibe shifted from robbery to tragedy in a matter of seconds. When the homeowner tried to protect his sanctuary, the twins didn't hesitate. They let the lead fly with a level of cold-blooded precision that showed they had completely checked out of their humanity. It was a chaotic scene, with the twins working like a well-oiled machine, one covering the door while the other did the dirty work. There was no mama bear to stop them this time, just a victim who stood no chance against two attackers who moved in total sync. The adrenaline was pumping, and for a moment they probably felt like they'd won the game. They fled the scene with a few valuables, leaving behind a shattered family and a code red investigation. They thought they were being low-key, vanishing into the night and confident that their twin connection would keep their secrets safe, but they'd left behind receipts, forensic evidence, and witnesses who were tired of the terror that were about to turn their win into a permanent L. Kenyatta and Kayshawn Blake soon found out that you can't outrun the feds when you're leaving a trail of destruction that big. The heat was on, and the local PD was joined by the heavy hitters to bring him down. The ride-or-die twins tried to stay under the radar, jumping from one trap house to another, but the walls were closing in fast. Their names were buzzing on the scanners, and their faces were all over the news as the twin terrorists who had crossed the line. The pressure was mounting, and even their closest associates started to feel sketchy about being around them. It's a lonely feeling when the whole world is looking for you, and even your day one isn't enough to stop the paranoia from sinking in. The investigation was methodical. The feds were snitching on their movements through burner phones and social media breadcrumbs. The twins were starting to realize that their invincible bond was becoming a liability. It's hard to hide when your partner looks exactly like you. Every siren they heard made their hearts hammer against their ribs, a constant reminder that they were cooked. They were living on borrowed time, and the clock was ticking down to a final confrontation that would end their run for good. The emotional weight of the lives they'd ruined was starting to catch up, but for the Blake twins, there was no undo button for the carnage they'd unleashed. Kenyatta and Kayshawn Blake finally saw their empire crumble when the tactical teams moved in for the final takedown. It wasn't a movie ending with a glorious shootout. It was a cold, hard realization that the game was over. They were cornered and forced to surrender, coming out with their hands up as the flashbangs and sirens filled the air. When they got to the courtroom, the ride-or-die pact was put to the ultimate test. They sat there in their jumpsuits, two identical faces of a tragedy that didn't have to happen. The legal hammer dropped with zero mercy. The judge handed them a life-in-the-pen sentence that ensured they would grow old behind concrete walls. They went from being the big bad wolves of the block to being just another set of numbers in the system. The real heartbreak was for their family, who had to watch two sons throw their lives away for a handful of jewelry and a rep that didn't mean anything in a prison cell. The Blake twins are a sobering reminder that a shared bond can lead you to the top or drag you straight to the bottom. They'll spend the rest of their days in separate cells, separated by the very law they thought they could break together. They died to the world the day they walked into that house, becoming unfortunate footnotes in the history of a city that was ready to move on without them. Edwin and Edward Burnt were the kind of day ones who were so locked into each other's orbit that the rest of the world basically didn't exist. They weren't out here trying to hit a lick or running around strapped like some of the other cats we talk about. They were just two brothers living a very quiet, very strange life in a Houston crib that looked like a total disaster zone from the outside. These twins were deep in their late 50s, but they still lived with their 89-year-old mother, Sybil, in a house that was slowly being swallowed by hoarding and neglect. The neighbors used to see them as the quiet ones, just two guys who kept to themselves, but the energy around that property was starting to get real sketchy. Inside those walls, the clutter was piled up to the ceiling, creating a maze of trash and forgotten memories that mirrored the mess inside their own heads. They weren't exactly criminal masterminds, but they were definitely operating on a wavelength that was miles away from reality. The community didn't realize that the Burnt twins were living in a ticking time bomb of a situation, fueled by a bond that was more about codependency than actual care. They were just chilling in the shadows, 3 people trapped in a cycle of isolation that was about to turn into a headline-grabbing tragedy that nobody in that Texas neighborhood would ever be able to unsee once the truth finally came out and hit the fan.
Edwin and Edward Burnt saw their world take a dark, silent turn when their mother, Sybil, finally passed away at the age of 89. Most people would have picked up the phone to call for help, but these two weren't exactly following the standard script for how to handle a loss. Instead of reaching out to the authorities or even a funeral home, they just stayed. They lived with their mother's body for several days, maybe even longer, as if she were still just sleeping in the next room. The house, which was already a total trap of trash and debris, became a tomb. As the Texas heat started to rise, the situation inside that crib became something out of a horror movie. Neighbors began to notice that things were looking real funny over at the burnt place. There was a smell, that heavy, sweet, unmistakable scent of decay that started wafting through the air, and the flies were beginning to cluster around the windows like they knew a secret the rest of the world didn't. People started whispering that the vibe was off, and eventually the concern reached a breaking point. Someone finally decided to call in a welfare check, realizing that the twins hadn't been seen in a minute and the mother was nowhere to be found. They didn't know they were about to send the local PD into a scene that was going to haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives as they entered. Edwin and Edward Burnt were still just chilling inside that nightmare of a house when the police finally rolled up to the door. When the officers first stepped into the crib, they were hit with a wall of stench that was so strong it felt like a physical blow. It was a code red situation from the second they crossed the threshold. Navigating through the mountains of trash, the cops finally made their way into the living area where they found the twins just sitting there, acting like everything was totally normal. And then they saw it. The remains of Sybil Burnt lying right there in the middle of the chaos. It was a folded situation. The twins had been eating, sleeping, and living their lives right next to their mother's decomposing body, as if the passage of time had just stopped for them. They weren't acting aggressive or like they were ready for a fight. They were just gone. Their mental state was so far out there that they couldn't even process the reality of death. The scene was pure nightmare fuel for the first responders who had to navigate that horde just to get to the body. It was a heart-wrenching realization that these two men had been so isolated by their own bond and their mental health struggles that they'd lost the ability to function as human beings. It was a total breakdown of the system and the self that left everyone involved feeling absolutely shook.
Edwin and Edward Burnt didn't face the same kind of crash-out legal charges as some of the other evil twins we've seen, mainly because the autopsy showed their mother had passed away from natural causes. There was no hit or calculated murder here, just a massive, tragic failure of mental health and social support. But that didn't mean they were home free. The state had to step in because they were clearly unable to take care of themselves or live in a way that wasn't a danger to public health. The twins were eventually removed from the property and placed into care, their day one bond finally being broken by the intervention of the law. The house, that tomb of trash and memories, was eventually cleared out, but the story of the burnt twins left a permanent scar on the neighborhood. It served as a cold reminder that isolation can be just as deadly as a bullet. People felt big sad for the whole situation, a mother who died in squalor and 2 sons who were so far gone they didn't know how to say goodbye. The twins went from being the quiet ones to being a cautionary tale about what happens when people fall through the cracks of society. They didn't choose the criminal life, but their shared reality was its own kind of prison long before the cops ever showed up. It was a somber end to a life lived in the deep, dark shadows of Houston.
Jared and Gerald Smith were identical twins from Maryland who took the concept of a ride-or-die bond to a dark, unthinkable extreme. On the outside, they looked like any other pair of brothers, but inside, they shared a cold-blooded synergy that made them a lethal duo. These two didn't just stumble into trouble, they operated like a coordinated unit, using their twin connection to stay in sync during their criminal activities. They were the kind of cats who stayed strapped and were always looking for a come-up, but their ambition was fueled by a total lack of empathy. In 2005, they decided to orchestrate a move that would change their lives forever, targeting a woman named Maria Elena Rivas. This wasn't just a random act, it was a calculated crash-out mission that showcased how dangerous two people can be when they share a single evil goal. They weren't just brothers looking for a hustle, they were predators who viewed other people as objects to be used and discarded. The air around them was always heavy with a sketchy vibe, and those who knew them realized that the Smith twins were a disaster waiting to happen. They were two sides of the same coin, and that coin was about to land on a tragedy that would leave a family shattered and a community in shock.
Jared and Gerald Smith officially crossed the line into pure savagery when they kidnapped Maria Elena Rivas. They didn't just want her valuables, they wanted to exert total control. In a heart-wrenching sequence of events, they took her to a remote area where the day-one bond between the brothers turned into a shared murder pact. It's absolutely disgusting to think about. Two grown men tag-teaming a defenseless woman, working together to snuff out a life for no reason other than their own sick impulses. They didn't hesitate and they didn't show mercy. The way they operated was like a two-man army, with one brother assisting the other in a crime that was as brutal as it was senseless. After the deed was done, they tried to be slick and cover their tracks, thinking that because they were twins, they could somehow outsmart the feds. They dumped her body like it was nothing, showing a level of disgust for human life that is hard to even process. They went back to their lives thinking they were home free, but the darkness they'd unleashed was already starting to leave a trail. They thought their bond was a shield, but it was actually a lead weight that was about to pull them both straight to the bottom.
Jared and Gerald Smith finally saw their shared destiny lead them straight to a courtroom and then to a prison cell. The legal hammer dropped with zero chill. The evidence was so overwhelming that there was no wrestling out of these charges. They were both convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping, receiving sentences that ensured they would never breathe free air again. It was a folded ending for two brothers who had so much potential to be something better. The real tragedy, as always, stayed with the victim's family, who had to live with the big sad of losing Maria to such a senseless act of violence. In separate cells, the Smith twins were finally forced to face the reality of their choices. Their bond, which they once thought made them powerful, was the very thing that ensured they both went down together. They went from being day ones to being just two more names on a prison roster, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can grow when siblings choose hate over love. They'll grow old in the quiet of a concrete room, a permanent reminder that no bond is strong enough to protect you from the consequences of a cold-blooded crime.